Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take the kind of information you might be tracking, piles of sources, and really boil it down to what matters. It's about getting you the key insights efficiently and maybe finding some connections you didn't expect.
Exactly. No need to wade through everything yourself.
So today, we're diving into a specific document, a weekly global security intelligence brief. It's dated May 18th, 2025. And our plan really is to unpack each story inside this brief, understand what makes each one significant, and, see how they might link together.
Right. Because these briefs, they often present things as separate updates. But when you look closer, you start seeing patterns, potential ripple effects. Each summary is like a snapshot of something developing.
Definitely. We've got a whole range here. Domestic policy shifts, big international military questions, even some historical preservation stuff. Let's get into it.
Yeah, looking forward to it. It's a fascinating mix this week. You get a real sense of a dynamic, interconnected world just from these few pages.
Okay, first story up. This one's domestic. The Department of Homeland Security, DHS, is requesting 20,000 National Guard troops. The purpose: mass deportations. That number, 20,000, that really jumps out. It feels like a huge deployment for something like this.
It absolutely is. You have to see it as a major escalation of what's already happening. Remember, there are already about 10,000 military personnel down at the border, so this request would effectively triple that military presence involved in immigration enforcement.
Triple it. Wow. And it sounds like this isn't straightforward. There's already legal friction.
That's right. The brief mentions a federal judge stepping in, dismissing trespassing charges against some migrants. And the reason cited was insufficient notification.
Insufficient notification. So people weren't properly warned they were on land where they could be arrested for trespassing, specifically by the military or in that context.
Precisely. It raises immediate serious questions about due process, about the legal basis for using military-designated land, or military personnel even indirectly, for civil arrests if people aren't clearly told what rules apply where.
Okay, so it's the scale and the legal mechanics. The brief mentions some recommendations to try and navigate this, right?
Yes, and they seem very targeted at these specific problems. First off, they suggest DHS and the Department of Defense need to work together to define very clearly what roles the Guard can lawfully play. They have to consider laws like posse comitatus, that's the one generally stopping the military from acting as domestic police, and also relevant bits of the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA.
So drawing clear legal lines. What else?
Second, mandatory notification protocols. Basically, clear rules for how and when people are warned if they're entering land being used in this military support context. That seems like a direct answer to that judge's ruling.
Makes sense. A direct fix.
And third, a kind of cautious approach initially. The recommendation is to limit the Guard at first to just support roles, things like maybe logistics, maybe surveillance, but not direct enforcement actions, at least not until there's more legal review. It suggests they're aware of the potential for more court challenges.
Right. Trying to stay on safer legal ground while this gets sorted. Interesting. Okay, let's shift gears now, look outwards. The brief raises a big what if about Europe's security if the U.S. were to, say, quickly pull back its military presence. There's a huge price tag mentioned in an estimate from the IS, between $226 billion and $344 billion needed for Europe to fill that gap. That's staggering.
It's an enormous figure, and it's not just about buying tanks or planes. It reflects really decades of European reliance on American military capabilities across the board. Think air defense, missile defense, sophisticated intelligence gathering, even just the sheer logistical muscle to move forces around. The U.S. provides a lot of that backbone.
And the worry isn't just the cost, it's the timing. The brief talks about a window of vulnerability.
Exactly. That's the core concern. If the U.S. withdraws quickly, even if there's a ceasefire in Ukraine, say, well, that rapid pullback could create a kind of power vacuum. The fear is Russia could potentially use that window to rebuild its own forces faster, maybe even feel emboldened to try something else down the line.
And it's not just about finding the money, is it? There's a physical limitation, too. The brief mentions Europe's industrial capacity.
That's a critical point. Even if European nations suddenly allocated those hundreds of billions, their defense industries aren't currently set up to just instantly churn out all the high-tech equipment needed to replace the U.S. capabilities. Ramping up that kind of production takes time. Factories need retooling, supply chains need building. It's a huge undertaking. This lack of immediate industrial capacity makes a quick U.S. withdrawal even riskier.
So what are the proposed steps then? How do they suggest mitigating this risk?
Well, the recommendations tackle both the short-term and longer-term picture. For the immediate term, more NATO joint exercises, specifically focused on rapid mobilization, getting better and faster at coordinating their existing forces.
Practice, practice, practice.
Pretty much. Then, speeding up grants from the European Defense Fund, pushing money out faster to actually boost weapons manufacturing and build up stockpiles of essential munitions and equipment.
Trying to kickstart that industrial piece.
Right. And looking further out, the brief pushes for something called a NATO Strategic Autonomy Fund. This would be targeted funding for specific critical areas where Europe is maybe most reliant on the U.S., things like high-end air defense, ISR capabilities, that's intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and missile deterrence. Basically a long-term investment plan to build up more independent European capacity in key areas.
Okay, a multi-pronged approach. Now let's pivot again back to the U.S. military, but looking at operational changes. The brief talks about multi-domain task forces, MDTFs, becoming central to Pacific strategy. What exactly are these MDTFs and why are they suddenly so important out there?
Yeah, this is a really significant evolution in Army thinking, especially for the Indo-Pacific. These MDTFs are units designed to operate across all domains, land, sea, air, space, cyber, simultaneously. And what makes them really potent is the kind of tech they're integrating. We're talking hypersonic weapons, like the Army's Dark Eagle missile.
Oh, hypersonics, okay. That's cutting edge.
Very. Plus the Typhon system, which can launch existing missiles like Tomahawks and SM-6s from the ground, and also the HIMARS rocket system, which people know from Ukraine, but equipped with a newer, longer-range PRSM missile. The brief even mentions future directed energy weapons potentially being part of the mix.
Wow, that's a serious toolkit. And the location matters, too. It highlights the one in Hawaii.
Absolutely. The third MDTF in Hawaii is specifically called out. Its position makes it strategically vital for covering the vast distances of the Indo-Pacific. It's clearly seen as a linchpin of the U.S. posture there.
So it's about combining these advanced weapons into a new way of operating. The brief talks about reshaping logistics, too.
Exactly. It's not just having the shiny new toys. It's about how you use them together. This integration of long-range precision fires, the speed of hypersonics, and AI-fused targeting. That means using artificial intelligence to help sort through sensor data and identify targets much faster. It all points to a future combat model based on striking farther, faster, and more accurately.
Which must change how you supply these forces, right? If they're hitting targets hundreds or thousands of miles away.
Precisely. It demands a whole new level of logistical agility. And the recommendations reflect that focus. They suggest expanding the MDPF presence, maybe basing elements in partner nations like the Philippines or Japan.
Spreading the capability out.
Right. For redundancy, makes it harder for an adversary to take it all out. And also investing more in AI for things like fire control systems and, crucially, sustainment modeling, using AI to predict logistical needs for these really fast-paced, complex joint operations.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, something perhaps less high-tech but still impactful. An issue within the U.S. Air Force. They apparently had to shut down their reenlistment bonus program early, 4 months early, because the money ran out. That sounds unusual.
It is quite unusual, yeah. It's actually a consequence of something generally seen as positive, high retention rates. Basically, more airmen decided to stay in than expected, so the pot of money allocated for bonuses got used up faster.
So good news that people want to stay, but bad news if you were counting on that bonus to re-up, especially in certain fields.
Exactly. It's a bit of a double-edged sword. And the brief points out the bonuses were specifically targeting critical areas like cybersecurity, intelligence, and aircraft maintenance. These aren't just any jobs. They're vital for keeping the Air Force running effectively. Losing potential re-enlistees in these fields because the bonus suddenly disappeared could cause real problems down the line.
Right. So what's the fix? The recommendations seem aimed at damage control.
They do. First, they suggest doing an early workforce projection for the next fiscal year, FY26. The idea is to get ahead of the curve and figure out where the remaining bonus money absolutely has to go, prioritizing the most critical skills, the MOS's military occupational specialties.
Smart. Allocating scarce resources better.
And the second part is looking beyond just cash. It recommends realigning non-monetary incentives, things that might encourage people to stay even without a big bonus check. That could mean offering more opportunities for remote work, which is increasingly popular, or better educational benefits, things like that. Recognizing that money isn't the only reason people serve.
Good point. Okay, let's swing back to the Pacific, specifically the South China Sea. Tensions there seem to be a constant feature. The brief mentions ongoing exercises called Commandog. Involves U.S. Marines from different places, Darwin, Hawaii, California, working alongside the Philippines, Japan, and Korea. That's quite a coalition.
It really is. Commandog is primarily a Philippine-U.S. exercise, but bringing in Japan and Korea sends a strong signal. And the timing isn't accidental. It's happening amidst those escalating tensions with the Chinese Coast Guard we keep hearing about in the South China Sea.
And the exercises themselves seem tailored to that environment, simulating maneuvers in disputed waters.
Yes. The brief explicitly mentions simulating anti-access maneuvers in disputed EZs, exclusive economic zones. That's directly relevant to the kinds of challenges regional nations face, like preventing another country from blocking access to their own waters or resources. It has counterinsurgency and unconventional warfare elements, too.
So practicing for potential flashpoints, what are the recommendations here? They seem focused on preparation and alliances.
Very much so. One recommendation is practical, immediate preparation. Prepositioning mobile field hospitals and humanitarian supplies on Philippine Islands. That's about being ready for a crisis, whether it's conflict-related or a natural disaster amplified by tensions.
Being ready to help quickly.
Right. And the other is diplomatic and legal. Reinforcing the EDCA Access Agreement, that's the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, giving U.S. forces more access to Philippine bases, and also shoring up bilateral rules of engagement with Manila. That means having really clear, agreed-upon rules for how U.S. and Filipino forces would operate together if something actually happened. It's about strengthening the alliance and improving deterrence.
Okay. Now for something completely different, but historically significant. The USS Arizona Memorial at Pearl Harbor. The brief mentions plans to remove some old salvage platforms from the wreck. Sounds like a delicate operation.
Extremely delicate. The Arizona is, of course, a war grave and a hugely important historical site. These salvage platforms were put in place decades ago, likely during initial recovery or survey efforts. But now they've degraded significantly in the marine environment. The concern is that if they collapse further, they could damage the actual submerged battleship wreck, the memorial structure built over it, or the surrounding seabed.
So removal is necessary for preservation. But how do you do that without losing the history associated with those platforms themselves?
That's where the recommendations come in. They emphasize meticulous documentation before anything is touched, specifically using underwater 3D photogrammetry. It's a technique that uses lots of overlapping photos to create incredibly detailed, accurate 3D digital models of underwater sites.
So capture it digitally before it's gone physically.
Exactly. And then the plan is to work with the National Park Service, who manages the memorial, to publish these digital models and create educational archives. That way, the public and researchers can still see what was there, understand its context, even after the physical structures are removed for safety and preservation reasons. It's about balancing preservation with historical access.
A thoughtful approach. Okay, final story. This one brings us back to a domestic legal issue involving a veteran. A Marine vet in Florida sentenced for using fraudulent military records. What was going on there?
Unfortunately, yes. This individual is found to have used faked discharge papers, the DD-214 form, repeatedly. The purpose was apparently to get government jobs that might have veteran preferences and also to improperly access benefits from the Department of Veterans Affairs, the VA.
So basically, identity theft related to military service, exploiting the system meant to help genuine veterans.
That's the core of it. The sentencing highlights that this does happen, and it underscores the need to protect the integrity of veteran status and benefits.
And the recommendations are aimed squarely at prevention, it seems, making it harder to cheat the system.
Yes, they focus on tightening up the verification process. One idea is implementing biometric validation for DD-214s when people apply for federal jobs or VA benefits. That could mean linking the document to a fingerprint or other unique identifier, making simple forgeries much harder.
Like adding a digital lock to the paper.
Sorta, yeah. The other key recommendation is better information sharing between government agencies. Creating shared databases could help spot someone using inconsistent or fraudulent service claims across different applications, applying for a job with one story, VA benefits with another. It's about connecting the dots to catch fraud earlier.
Makes sense. Protecting the system for those who genuinely deserve it.
Well, that really covers a lot of ground, doesn't it? From potential massive National Guard deployments here at home to huge strategic funding questions in Europe, cutting-edge military tech in the Pacific, internal Air Force personnel issues, ongoing tensions in the South China Sea, delicate historical preservation, and even strengthening safeguards against fraud in veterans' benefits. It's quite the snapshot of the security landscape just from 1 week's brief.
It really is. And like you said at the start, while we looked at each story individually, you can definitely start to see potential connections, or at least how decisions in one area could easily impact another.
Absolutely. Resource allocation is a big one. If you commit 20,000 guard troops to the border, what does that mean for their availability for other missions, domestic or overseas? And the strategic calculations in Europe versus the Pacific, they're inevitably linked, aren't they? How the U.S. postures itself in one theater affects perceptions and realities in the other. These things don't happen in isolation.
No, they certainly don't. Each story we touched on today, it really reveals some important underlying currents, some potential friction points, some challenges ahead.
Which brings us to a final thought, something for you, the listener, to chew on. Looking at this range of stories, the border situation, European defense, the Pacific MDTFs, Air Force retention, South China Sea exercises, the Arizona, the VA fraud case. Which one, or maybe which combination, do you think holds the most weight for the long term? Which developing situation might cast the longest shadow on global security, or maybe U.S. policy down the road? And crucially, why?
Yeah, it's worth considering what ripples will spread furthest. We encourage you to keep digging into these topics, keep thinking critically about how these pieces fit together.